At 5:41, we're going to start the April meeting of the Santa Barbara Creeks and Watersheds Advisory Committee, and we'd like to ask the clerk to call the roll to make sure a quorum is present.
Mr. Moldaver?
Here.
Ms. Owens? Here. Ms. Weber? Here. Ms. Lomas? Here. Thank you.
Before we do that, do we have a motion to accept the draft minutes of the previous meeting? I know it was a really momentous one. Many lives were changed, but we have to get it into the record. But you can make the motion.
I'll make the motion. I was there.
All right. So there's a... all right. Are there any corrections, amendments, or additions to the draft minutes? Hearing none, all those in favor of accepting the draft minutes signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Okay. So I guess the minutes are adopted on a dramatic 2-0 with 2 abstentions vote. Okay. So it's 3-0 with 1 abstention. Are there, Mr. Benson, any adjustments to the advertised agenda?
No adjustments, Mr. Chair, but I do have one announcement. Today I received a resignation letter from the committee from James Hawkins. He has been accepted into graduate school in public policy up at UC Berkeley, and so he's looking forward to that. He's going to be moving up there in June, so he wasn't able to make it tonight, but he will be here for our May meeting. I wanted to let you guys know that and to thank and acknowledge James for all his hard work on this committee. We'll be able to see him next month, but I also wanted to let the public know that the city is in the midst of a semi-annual recruitment for advisory committees, including this one. You can go to the city's website at santabarbaraca.gov and find the application for the committees, and we will have this spot available, and the appointment would start in June.
Now, Mr. Hawkins has done really distinguished work, but for any members of the public, we can't guarantee that the semi-annual creek fact-finding trips to Bermuda and Maui will continue as they have in the past. But it's a great committee to be a part of, so please get your applications in.
And the application deadline is May 2nd.
Right around the corner. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Benson. Are there any committee member or staff communications since last month's meeting? I have a brief one. I was able to go with our staff biologist, Dr. Jill Murray, to microbial source tracking conference at UCSB a week ago Monday. It was put on by Dr. Trish Holden, and they were talking about the methodology and results for examining various watersheds in the Santa Barbara area for various bacterial and viral indicators and what they may or may not mean and what the next phases of research might be. But I suspect Dr. Murray is going to give an extensive summary of that conference, so I'll just leave it at that.
Mr. Chair, we're actually, I just had a discussion with her this morning. We're actually looking at having that as a presentation at our May meeting, and we'll have some of the UCSB researchers here to provide the presentation.
Yeah, it was a very fascinating meeting, and a lot of the inputs were actually somewhat counterintuitive from what people in the public would expect. But other than that, we have 2 main business items. The first one is the Upper Arroyo Burrow restoration at Barger Canyon. And we're very, very fortunate. I think Mr. Benson is going to introduce the newest staff addition to the Creek and Watershed program to give that presentation.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Tonight we have Erin Markey, who is our Creek Restoration Planner at the Creeks Division, and she is the project manager for the Upper Arroyo Burrow Restoration Project, and she's going to let you know what our status is and where we're going in the next couple months with it.
All right. So thank you for having me. and I'm just going to jump right in. The Upper Arroyo Borough Restoration Project at Barger Canyon is a restoration project the Creeks Division has been working on for a little while now. The project site is located in an area we call Barger Canyon. It's the upper portion of the main stem of Arroyo Borough Creek, just above Highway 192 or Foothill Road. Let's see, does my cursor? Yeah. So outlined here in red. The site was previously identified by the Creeks Division as having active bank erosion and as a target for future restoration activity. And the project's location is a parcel that was actually purchased by the Creeks Division back in 2013. So here's a close-up of that parcel shown in red. It's a 14.19 acre parcel owned by the city. And at the time that it was acquired, a conservation easement was also negotiated over the adjacent portion of the neighbor's property along the creek corridor, shown here in green. So that conservation easement protected an additional 1.5 acres of creekside habitat into the future, and additionally allowed for our restoration project to extend into that creek area. And then just in yellow are 2 existing access easements that are shown. This lower one will be the main access point for construction in the future, as well as future access to the project site. So just some of the existing conditions to go over some of the things that we're looking to remediate through this restoration project. The existing riparian zone is somewhat reduced, especially in the lower portion of the canyon. There's almost no riparian vegetation along the creek. The channel is incised in portions. There are steep eroding banks. This lower portion of the channel also appears to have been straightened at some point, and I'm going to go through some historic images to show you that context. There are a number of structures throughout the creek. There's 2 vehicular bridges, a couple remnant pedestrian bridges, as well as numerous sections of bank hardening, concrete banks, revetment, all of which are destabilizing creek banks, and a mix of native and non-native vegetation, and a lot of non-native trees that we will be seeking to remove. So I'm just going to run through a few historic images to kind of give the context of how the property came to be in the condition that it is today. So the oldest historic image we could find was from 1928, and as you can see from the previous, there are far more large trees, mostly oak trees, although within the riparian zone there are what seem to be probably sycamores along the creek corridor. We assume the property was likely grazed, so this isn't a completely intact, point in history, but it's a starting point that is in better condition than the existing conditions. So moving on to 1954, there starts to be some development in the adjacent parcels. Barger Canyon Road is in its current configuration at this point, and the Highway 192 also is in its current configuration at this point. There's a loss of a number of trees from the previous image as well. I just wanted to point out that you can see the creek still has some meander at this point in that lower portion of the watershed, where today it's quite straightened. And then moving to 1966, there's a drastic change. At some point between 1954 and 1966, the property was converted to an orchard. The riparian zone was completely removed in this lower portion. There's no trees when you zoom in here. It's just low-growing vegetation. In addition, at this point, the creek channel was straightened between these 2 bridges. So the 7 circles here are structures that cross the creek that appear to be bridges at this point. These 2 are still present on the site today as vehicular bridges, and one of these is still present as a pedestrian bridge. In addition, at this time, there's now a house right here on the east bank, very close to what would be the existing top of bank. And today there is a section about 300 feet long of concreted stream bank there that I assume went in to protect this structure at some point in the past. So The land use actually stayed pretty consistent from 1966 until 2006, when the previous property owner came in and removed the majority of the orchard. She actually cut down and removed the orchard trees, as well as cleared the riparian zone again. So then 2 years later, here we are in 2008, there's some riparian vegetation starting to recover in this upper portion, but really a lack of riparian vegetation in this lower zone. You can see this house was still here in 2008. And in 2009, the Hayes-Zeta fire came through and actually burned this whole canyon. And at that time, this house was burned in the fire, as well as a number of the other wooden structures on the property and some of the existing trees. So moving back to this aerial was taken last year, more recent conditions. You can see that this upper riparian zone really has recovered some. There are thickets of willow on the project site, but this lower portion is still rather barren. We have a number of non-native species that have come into the site since the removal of the orchard and the fire in 2009. Palms, acacias, all of which will be targeted as part of the restoration effort. So similar to some of those existing conditions, the goals for the restoration project look to address some of these issues. So we hope to increase the riparian zone as well as the diversity of native plant species that occur on the project site. We hope to lay back bank instabilities, lay back the bank to a more stable slope, revegetate with native plants, as well as remove a number of the unnatural hardened bank features. And in this lower portion where the channel has been straightened, we will be reintroducing some meanders in this lower portion of the channel, as well as removing a number of non-native trees, 45 non-native trees, and revegetating all disturbed areas with locally collected native plants. And through these efforts, the Creeks Division will not only be improving wildlife habitat within the site, but also hopes to improve watershed health through reduced erosion and improved water quality downstream. So just a few more photos of the site. This is from the upper end of the property looking back out to the ocean. You can see this thicket of riparian, basically just willows within the incised existing channel, and a number of the non-native species. We're talking about Peruvian peppers, palms. We've got lots of fan palms in the lower area of the watershed, castor bean, tree tobacco, and a number of annual non-natives, mustard, hemlock, and annual grasses. This is what the creek looks like in the lower portion of the watershed. So it's hard to even really see, but this is the creek flowing here from left to right in this highly straightened portion of the creek that lacks any real riparian vegetation. There's a few coyote bush down in there, but otherwise there's no native vegetation in this section. So jumping into our proposed project designs. The Creeks Division has been working with Questa Engineering to develop the designs for this project. And to orient you, we've kind of flipped our orientation. North is now to the left in order to fit the designs better on the plan sheet. Foothill Road is over here to the right. And this just shows all of the unnatural features, hard surfaces that are currently on the project site that will be removed as part of the construction project. So an asphalt roadway that exists along the east bank. That is the current main access to the property at this point. This vehicular bridge, there's another vehicular bridge over here, and just a number of other structures, telephone poles, old pedestrian bridges, revetment structures. And so just to go through a few of those, this is one of the existing bridges that will be coming out. This concrete abutment will be removed, and this bank will be laid back to a more stable and natural slope. There's numerous sections of pipe and wire revetment, all of which will be removed, in addition to non-native plants like the castor bean and yucca that are here. And then just another example of concrete rubble and just other debris that is all over the creek channel and will be removed as part of the project. So jumping into more of the project designs, this is our grading sheet that shows the real extent of the project. So existing grading is shown in this lighter gray, and proposed new grading is shown in this darker, bolder grade. So the first thing you notice is that in this lower portion of the channel, we're really widening the channel and bringing back some meanders to the creek, as well as providing an additional secondary channel or a braided channel through this section, so that we can widen the creek channel, widen the riparian zone, and just increase beneficial habitat within this reach. And so with this increased width of riparian zone and more naturally restored hydraulic conditions, that we're actually going to be lowering the slope of this section, but by adding back in these meanders. And with that, we hope to have kind of regular flooding and inundation of these flood terraces and secondary channels, to allow for greater treatment of storm flows and infiltration of storm flows. The next thing to note is that most of the fill material that will be graded out of this lower widening section will be used on site to create what we're calling an upland wetland feature. So this large depression is about 7,000 square feet, and it will capture runoff from the adjacent properties, roads, and hillsides, and be used to kind of capture that runoff, let it settle, treat the runoff, and then hopefully infiltrate into the groundwater. And as well, this feature provides an additional area of wetland habitat to improve diversity and increase wildlife habitat on the project site. And then lastly, to note, there are sections where we will be restoring stream banks, so laying back the creek banks as I described in areas that are eroded, as well as rebuilding the stream channel in a few sections with a mixture of kind of native boulders and cobbles to mimic the natural stream channel. The stream channel will be rebuilt with this material to provide fish passage, as was required by the project from National Marine Fisheries Service, and to reduce future channel adjustment and incision. And this is a detail of the cross sections of those sections of stream channel. So these weirs are U-shaped. They'll be built with large boulders to lock in the stream channel. And in addition, I just wanted to point out that there are a few willows on the project site that are unavoidable during construction, and so we will be having the contractor harvest about 800 live willow stakes from these willows that we will be reusing as a revegetation measure in these sections of rebuilt channel. And so these are cross-sectional views that show kind of that widened lower channel area. And you can see here's our low flow channel, and this large wide flood terrace is designed to flood on just the 2-year interval. So regularly inundated with water, storm flows. And then in the braided sections, same thing, this low flow channel, or the low flow channel, the elevation has been set such that the high flow channel will be inundated on that 2-year storm event. And this just gives a rough idea of some of the revegetation that will be taking place and what it might look like. We're going to be using wetland species, sedges and rushes within the stream corridor, and transitioning up into more riparian species, and then up into more upland species, oaks and coastal sage scrub. So this plan sheet just shows the rough planting details and the different zones that we will be planting our different species. You can see wetland species will be more within the stream channel. These islands will actually be vegetated with riparian species, so sycamores, cottonwoods, willows, as well as understory species, and then transitioning out into more upland species. There will be 4,600 native container plants installed at the project site. We've ordered plants from a local nursery, Santa Barbara Natives and Estero Natives. And these will be installed across both of the disturbance grading areas to restore native riparian habitat. in addition to the willow stakes we talked about, and native seed that we've been collecting will be spread on site as well. So we're currently working to put the project out to bid soon. The project will actually be bid under 2 separate contracts, one for construction and one for the landscaping portion of the project. And Questa, our engineers, has put together a detailed cost estimate of what those 2 bids will expected to cost. And the construction estimate includes all of the demolition and off-haul of those materials, non-native tree removal, rebuilding of the stream channel, grading out of that lower channel, and building of that upper wetland area. And the landscape contract will cover the installation of all the erosion control measures, installation of all the native plants and revegetation efforts, as well as the relocation of 8 small oak trees that will be relocated out of the disturbance area prior to the project getting started, and the installation of an irrigation system at the site. So right now we're looking at a total estimated budget of just over $1 million, $1,025,000. And so our kind of timeline and next steps, we're currently wrapping up our environmental reviews and permits, and planning to take the project out to bid probably the second week of May, in hopes of starting construction in the middle of July. We expect that the construction portion of the project will take about 3 months, and that the landscaping portion will take about 2 months. So we're hoping the project will be wrapped up by the end of November. And that's it. You guys have questions?
No, thank you very much, Johan. Are there any questions on the Aurora Borough Barger Canyon project? Ms. Lomas?
Thank you for that report. I do have some questions. You said you were going to harvest the willows on site and you're going to start construction in June. Are you planning to have a bird nesting survey done so we don't have any impacts to breast birds?
Yes. So we're hoping the project will start in July. And so, yes, we will be within nesting bird season, and we will be doing surveys for 2 weeks prior to make sure that there are no nesting birds and impacts.
Great. And the other is more of a suggestion than a question. You said you have lots of container plants, and I, of course, can't see the species list, tiny little writing, but I would recommend that some of those plantings are not only going to be used for cover, but for food sources for birds like elderberry, lemonade berry, something that that gives it a richer habitat than just cover for small mammals and birds.
Yeah, we will be planting both elderberry and blackberry, and a number of species that will be food sources for birds.
Wonderful, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Ms. Markey? I've got one that I'm sure you're eager to talk about, and it occurred to me because I was at a meeting at this time yesterday where I was receiving a water presentation from Rebecca Bjork, our Public Works Director, and a challenge for landscape and habitat restoration projects all over California the last few years is not only to do a good landscape design and do a good mix of native plants, for a good ecological habitat, but how are we and where are we going to get the water to establish and maintain them for the first couple of years so that we know that they can switch over to seasonal rainfall in a time when water is at historically low precipitation rates?
It'll be a challenge. The plan is to hopefully install the plants in October and hope that we get early rains to get them established, and those rains continue into the spring. But an irrigation system will be in place in order to ensure their success for at least the first summer.
Yeah, Natasha?
Is there a way of getting recycled water from the sewage treatment plants and trucking it up there? Is that a potential? I mean, I know some of the plants are now going to tertiary treatment
Yeah, the location of this site is actually on Goleta Water. It's actually outside the city limits, so I'm not sure that the infrastructure is really in place to be able to do that. So yeah, I don't know that that's an option.
Are there any other questions for Ms. Markey? Well, I want to welcome you again to the Creeks Division and thank you for a really informative and detailed first public presentation.
Thanks for having me.
That brings us to item 7B, which is probably the one that most of our fans at home have been waiting for since last month's meeting, the fiscal year 2017 budget. That's going to be presented by Cameron Benson. Cameron?
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. This evening I'm going to be presenting the proposed budget for fiscal year 2017 for the Creeks Division. I'll start out just by talking a little bit about our process. Most of you have been involved in this before, but for folks at home, and for those of you who don't remember what we did last year, the year before that, is the city has a 2-year financial planning process or budget cycle. We're in the second year of that 2-year process right now. The Creeks Advisory Committee Budget Subcommittee met on March 10th. We went through a detailed review of the budget on a line-by-line basis. The subcommittee made a recommendation to this committee to approve the budget as presented, but had some questions and concerns about the street sweeping line item, so we'll talk about that a little bit more this evening. Yesterday, the City Council received a presentation on the overall city budget from the City Administrator and the Finance Director. And obviously, we're here tonight. Next week, we'll be at the Parks and Recreation Commission. I'll be presenting the Creeks Division budget as part of the Parks and Recreation departmental budget. And then we'll be presenting the Parks and Recreation Department budget to the City Council on May 16th. I think the City Council then has deliberations and ultimately approves the budget sometime in June. At least we hope they do. As you all know, the Creeks Division is funded almost exclusively by Measure B, which is a voter-approved 2% hotel bed tax. It was approved back in November of 2000. It's a special fund, which means it's a restricted. The funds are restricted to surface water quality improvement, stormwater, and creek restoration improvements. The Creeks Division receives no funding from the city's general fund. One other thing I wanted to mention about that is when we're projecting our revenues in terms of funding, as you know, we do receive a lot of grant funding. We go pretty aggressively after grants, but we don't include that in our projected revenue. It's just we find it to be too speculative to really count on it, but it's great when it shows up. So getting to the numbers, I'll start out with the revenue. Our fiscal year 2017 projected revenues are essentially flat from the current fiscal year. We're looking at about a $6,500 increase there. Other revenues are about the same, so overall we're looking at a projection of a $30,000 increase, so essentially flat across the board on all of our revenue forecasting. On the expenditure side, our proposed FY17 budget is substantially similar to the current year. There are a few exceptions, the largest one being an increase in our capital improvement program transfer of $150,000. We also have some differences in the salaries and benefits, supplies and services primarily, and then some small decreases in our special projects funding. We'll get into that a little bit more detail in a little bit. So here's our budget breakdown by category. So It's just a pie chart that shows, I guess in a different form, what the previous item showed. But you can see from this that our largest single item in our proposed FY17 budget, like it is every year, is our capital improvement program transfer at 36%. Second highest is our salaries and benefits line item at 30%, and then our supplies and professional services, so that's contract work that we have out in the community, like creek cleanup contractors and landscape maintenance in our restoration projects and so forth. And this is our table that breaks down our entire budget into the three main categories of work that the Creeks Division does, and that's water quality improvement, creek restoration, and then community outreach and education. We break this down with our capital projects included, but then we also break it down without the capital projects, and capital projects can have a pretty significant influence on those percentages. A while back, this committee had generally directed the staff to utilize about 50% of the funding we had for water quality improvement, about 25% for creek restoration, and 25% for community outreach. And so you can tell in terms of our operational budget, we're pretty close to those numbers and adhere pretty close to them. Our capital projects change year to year based on, whether it's a major focus on the water quality improvement project in any given year, and so that can really change a lot from year to year. And this pie chart just breaks those numbers down further, so you can see how much is going into our operational budget or our programmatic budget, and how much into our capital budget. So you can see the biggest areas are water quality programs, and then we have behind that our creek restoration capital program for this particular year. Those are our largest areas in the proposed budget. So some of our key issues for next year's budget, our revenue projections are flat. That's okay. We've seen years where they've gone down, and the last few years we've seen pretty significant growth. So going forward, we're going to be okay with that type of projection. We do, as I mentioned, have a pretty significant increase in our capital program transfer, $150,000 this year. With regard to our creek restoration maintenance, it's interesting to look at our costs with our water quality projects compared to our restoration maintenance costs. Water quality projects, our costs for maintenance go up over time. Things wear out and we have replacement costs. It's the opposite with our creek restoration maintenance. Once we complete a project, we've got a lot of maintenance, a lot of weeding, and we've got irrigation issues to maintain. But over time, we end up turning off the irrigation, so there's no cost associated with that. And once we have our plants established, we have a lot less weeding and a lot less maintenance work to do, so those costs go down over time. So as you all know, we've recently purchased a couple of significant properties. One of them you saw in the presentation before, and a little over 14 acres in Upper Arroyo Borough. We recently purchased another 15 acres down in Lower Arroyo Borough. So that's the reason for the cost increase, even though on some of our other projects the actual costs of maintenance are going down. You also see a slight increase in our invasive plant removal program. So that's our arundo removal that's going on. The reason the actual cost of running that program from the current year to next year is the same, but we had some grant funding coming in the current year that we won't have next year. So that's kind of an indication of where you see that grant funding kind of displaces Measure B funds that would otherwise be going to these programs. And then our budget is essentially balanced. We are projecting to end the year with a little over $50,000 in surplus that would go into our reserve. So here's what we're spending some of that money on. We have our water quality research and monitoring program. These numbers are essentially unchanged from the current year going into next year. And other ongoing programs. As I mentioned, we spend a lot of money doing creek cleanups. We have a contractor out 2 and sometimes 3 days a week in the same locations pulling trash out of the creeks. We pull about 55 tons of trash out of the creeks every year. We have our youth watershed education program, which is where we're in schools doing watershed education in the classroom and also at the Watershed Resource Center. We have a significant public service announcement campaign through television, radio, also internet advertising. We have print advertising. And then we do a fairly significant amount of work with our city TV programs that allow us to go into depth on some of the issues and the projects we're working on. City TV does a wonderful job producing those segments, and then they're available online as well as on the City TV channel. And then, of course, your meetings, which are always riveting. For our street sweeping line item, when we approved the 2-year financial plan for FY16-17, the proposed transfer for the street sweeping program for FY17 was $139,000. Just before we had our subcommittee meeting on March 10th, the Streets Division had informed us that they had revised their request for the transfer for this year up to $165,000. And we've been working with them and with the finance director, and we have a new recommendation for the FY17 budget at $100,000. Current year budget is $70,000. I also would remind the committee, I think 5 or 6 years ago, our contribution was more in the $200,000 range. So this is the so $100,000 is the current recommendation for the next fiscal year. This is a table showing our line items for our capital program transfer. The committee reviewed these numbers as part of our capital program last October. Just to update you on a couple of these things, we have our Las Positas Creek Restoration Project. We're looking at putting $300,000 into that project this year. That will get us to almost fully funded. We have $1 million grant that we were awarded for that project. We have a $500,000 grant pending for it. This is a tributary to Arroyo Burro, runs along Las Positas Road, where we're looking at removing a concrete channel and restoring the creek section. We're hoping to start, we're in final design on that now. We're hoping to start construction on that next summer, 2017, excuse me. Our stormwater treatment retrofit projects, these are our demonstration projects. We're hoping to be going to construction on the Quarantina Street road replacement, where we're replacing the asphalt in the roadway and the sidewalks with permeable pavers. We expect to start construction sometime in the first week of May on that project. And then, as Ms. Markey just presented, we have our Upper Arroyo Burro Restoration Project, and I just wanted to bring that one up in particular because when we did our capital improvement program, we had estimated a $250,000 contribution for FY17, and we've upped that to $350,000 to get us close to a balance where we'll have our full funding for that project. We have had to add some elements to that project that increase the cost for us, including, as was mentioned, fish passage elements and also additional rock element for flooding purposes. So the price is coming in a little higher, and we did apply for a grant for that project, which we were unsuccessful with. So we're adding some money to that one. So, as you know, we have unappropriated reserves for the Creeks Division. The committee has directed what the purpose of those reserves should be. It's for capital projects. It's for difficult economic times, and the committee has has set a goal for us to maintain a balance that is in the range of 2 capital projects costs for us. So we've estimated that to be about $3 million. So that's always our target we're looking for. We think we're going to end our current fiscal year at the end of June with a balance of about $3.3 million. And with that additional surplus at the end of FY17, we should be right in that ballpark. So we're on target with our reserve balance. This has been another successful year for grants for the Creeks Division. We have, as I mentioned, received $1 million grant from the California Department of Water Resources for our Las Positas Creek restoration project. That's been awarded. We have a $500,000 grant pending with the California Natural Resources Agency for the same project. If we were to get that would leave us about 50% grant funded on that project. And we also were successful teaming up with UCSB and the U.S. Geological Survey on a grant for $250,000 for neonicotinoid pesticide research project. That grant isn't going onto our books. It's actually going through UCSB, but we're very involved in the framing of that project and the securing that grant. And this is a slide that just shows our capital improvement program funding and the sources of that funding over the past several years. And one of the things that you can see here is we often have years where the blue is the Measure B contribution, the green is grant funding. We often have years where the grant funding far exceeds the Measure B contribution. But it's always different. It goes up and down. It's not super reliable. You can see here, FY14, we didn't get completely skunked, but we came really close. I think that we had a $10,000 grant for a project that year. But in other years, going back to fiscal year 10, we had more grant funding come in than we had all of the Measure B funds for that year, and that's happened for us a couple of times just in the last few years. So grant funding is obviously a very important source of funds for us to be able to accomplish a lot for the community. We're very aggressive at looking for grants and leveraging the Measure B funds wherever we can. Without those funds, we wouldn't have gotten the same number of projects done, and we wouldn't be anywhere near our reserve balance target. So since the Creeks Division has started, we've received over $18 million in grant funding. And with that, I'll conclude the presentation and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for a great overview, Mr. Benson. For the people watching at home and in the audience, as Mr. Benson pointed out, our budget committee's already met on this privately and asked a lot of detailed questions and conversations with the staff. So with that prologue, are there any questions tonight for Mr. Benson on the upcoming budget? Well, I guess that shows what a great job having the budget committee go over this in great detail is. When the overall budget was presented to council yesterday by Mr. Casey and Mr. Samario, did the council offer any general questions in this topic? I know they were covering a lot of territory, and I guess they were trying to explain some of the revenue areas are slightly down from their original anticipation. But did anything about us come up?
No. I think that generally speaking, those questions come up in the more detailed presentations as we go through the departmental presentations. And
I'd be unkind and ungracious not to ask our liaison in the office if you have any questions based on what you've heard tonight. All right. I think we're looking for, if there are no further questions or comments, I think we're looking for a recommendation in support of this budget to be shared both with the Parks and Recreation Commission and with the City Council. Is there a motion to endorse the 2017 budget recommendation for the Creeks Advisory Committee and all the Creeks programs?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Betsy. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Ms. Lomas. Are there any questions or comments on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Are there any abstaining? All right, let the record show that the motion is passed unanimously, and our Park and Recreation liaison can report back that it truly was unanimous without any controversy. Yeah. I believe that brings us to item number 8, which is always a two-part thing, where our staff is going to remind the public at large about the time and place of our next meeting, because the public is always welcome. And then we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
That's what I have on my.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the next meeting of the Creeks Advisory Committee will be Wednesday, May 18th at 5:30 p.m. at City Hall in the City Council chambers.
Well, that means that there's going to be really spacious seating available for all our fans who are watching on TV. So if you want to take this one meeting to come down and see this exciting meeting in person, you know, the May meeting might be your time. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
It's been moved and seconded that we adjourn at 6:27 p.m. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned. Thank you.